And there you could clearly see that the Dutch were depicted as the bad guys, right? Initially the Dutch did not come to Indonesia to colonize. They actually conquered the town of Jayakarta, burned it down, and they built the city of Batavia. Because it's like originally Dutch games, or at least from the colonial period, but they're being played every year in current contemporary Indonesia. There was one part of the archipelago that was not returned to Indonesia, and that was Papua, or West New Guinea. And then Sukarno said, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with the Netherlands anymore, kicked out the ambassador, all relations were cut. I've never had a confrontation where people called me a colonialist or something, but it's not weird. I visited once, a few years ago, the diorama exhibition in the Monas, in the National Monument, and there you could clearly see that the Dutch were depicted as the bad guys, right? And the reason behind, or like the reason why these dioramas were there in the first place was to teach Indonesians about their national history in a context where, that's at least how I understood it, a lot of Indonesians didn't have an education or couldn't read or write. So then the diorama are very visual, so a very strong tool to convey a message, right, to people. Initially the Dutch did not come to Indonesia to colonize, like to seize a lot of land and to create an empire. That's not why they came. They came very easily to trade and to make money. Then actually Jakarta, or then was called Batavia, was not even the first place where they arrived. First they went to the Moluccas and to the Banda Islands because of the nutmeg and the spices that they could get there that were they could sell for a lot of money in Europe, or in the Netherlands, but also in other parts of Europe. And the reason, for example, why they came here, why they settled in what is now Jakarta, is because they needed one center, a trading hub, where all the ships from the different islands could come together, and then all the spices and other materials and products that they would want to ship back to the Netherlands, they were assembled here and then put on ships to go back to go to Europe. So yeah, initially the Dutch asked permission to have like a small trading post in the village or the town of Jayakarta. But when they realized that they needed a more certain stronghold, because the British were also there at the time, they actually conquered the town of Jayakarta, burned it down, and they built the city of Batavia. That would eventually grow out into the capital city of the Dutch East Indies, and now of course Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia. So what did happen, like in 1799 the VOC went bankrupt and all its assets were transferred to the Dutch state. And this was a time when the Dutch started to think like, okay, maybe there's other ways we can make money. For example, in coffee or in tea. But for that you need a lot of land, right? You need to be able to have plantations. And that's actually where the expansion from these trading posts like to the rest of the islands started to happen, and that's when it started to colonize, like what we know as colonization. So these are like more like the hardcore or the hardware of colonialism, but what happened at the same time is there was people that met and that started families together. So for example, there was a lot of Dutch men who got a Dutch wife or a Dutch concubine. So what happened is that people mixed, and you got Indies people, so that's mixed Dutch or European with Indonesian. And not only people, like families, became mixed, but also cultures became mixed. So for example, the rijsttafel is in a way an Indonesian version of a banquet which were held in European courts or in affluent families have a large table with a lot of food to show the wealth of the hosts. And that was basically the rijsttafel was the Indonesian version of that, because of course with the rijsttafel we have all these different dishes like the meats and the fishes and the vegetables. So to show off, like the more different dishes you could serve as a host, the more rich you could say you were. And other aspects of the mixed culture is indeed poncho music, which, and I would say, is it popular in the Netherlands still? Yes, it's popular in the Netherlands, but with people who have family relations in Indonesia, so who have a connection with Indonesia, so who feel something with that music. I think the food was also a product of the mixed culture, the Indies culture. Is it perceived as Dutch nowadays? Because it is still eaten. You have like restaurants where you can, you know, Indonesian or Indo-Dutch or Chinese Indonesian restaurants where you can eat these dishes. But again, well, wait, is it something that's perceived as Dutch? Maybe not, but I'm sure that if Indonesians would go to the Netherlands and have dinner in those restaurants, they would be like, what is this nasi goreng? Right, so it's probably a Dutch variation with much less sambal, for example. So it's not considered Dutch, it's still considered Indonesian or Dutch Indonesian or Indies. But it's definitely a different variation of what you would get here. On the other hand, I'm sure there's, like, I know there's also very big differences regionally in Indonesian between the different nasi gorengs, for example, right? So it's maybe a little bit like that. I would say probably nasi goreng, because that's really like a family dish. It's so typical, but it's something that we also eat a lot when we're gathered as family. Then my mom or my aunt, my grandmother or my aunts, they make nasi goreng. I can also make nasi goreng myself. So for me it's very interesting to learn that these typical like colonial games are, that they still take place here sometimes in Indonesia, but that they're being played on your Independence Day, on 17 August. And for me that's really interesting, because it's like originally Dutch games, or at least from the colonial period, but they're being played every year in current contemporary Indonesia. So that's for me very interesting. And when you ask whether these games are still played in the Netherlands, I would say so. Like small children maybe play them at schools, you know, for special festivities or something. But when it comes to like what you would call the biggest day in the Netherlands is probably King's Day. So that's the day to celebrate the birthday of the king. It's a very traditional but also very old-fashioned, these games, right? So you see nowadays, or for already a couple of years, that you know, like even the festivities on King's Day are being modernized. So it doesn't happen that much anymore. So of course what happened after Indonesia became independent, and there is at this moment still two different dates for that. For Indonesia and for a lot of other countries in the world, it's 17 August 1945. For the Dutch government, it's still I don't even know the name, don't even know the exact date, but December 1949, the Round Table Conference. So upon Indonesia's independence, what actually happened, there were a lot of colonial structures that still continued, even though Indonesia was independent. So for example, there was a lot of colonial buildings that were reused by the Indonesian government. There was the language Dutch was still spoken by the elite, Indonesian elites, because they had Dutch at school here during the Dutch East Indies period. There was, of course, infrastructure that was originated from the Dutch colonial period. There was people who were mixed, like we talked about before. But there was also, for example, Dutch companies were still continuing their exploitation and their industries here in Indonesia. And there was one part of the archipelago that was not returned to Indonesia, and that was Papua, or West New Guinea. And that, of course, was very difficult for the new relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands, And you can imagine the Dutch tried to hold on to at least a small bit of the archipelago, but Indonesia wanted fully to be independent, not to have like the Dutch companies there anymore. And President Sukarno became more and more annoyed with the Dutch presence, like the Dutch influence still in Indonesia. So at some point this came to like an explosion, and there were riots at the then Dutch embassy, it was called the High Commissioner's Office, because the Dutch had sent a navy ship to Papua to protect its interests. And then Sukarno said, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with the Netherlands anymore, kicked out the ambassador, all relations were cut. And then, only then, after international pressure, the Netherlands transferred Papua via the United Nations to Indonesia, and once that happened, that was in 1963, the relationship could normalize. And you see that right like 5 years later, in 1968, there was an agreement signed on cultural collaboration, cultural diplomacy between Indonesia and the Netherlands, and from that point onwards, cultural diplomacy of culture was a way in which to bring the two countries closer together. So when it comes to, like, there is a lot of objects in the Dutch National Collection, so in the collection of national museums in the Netherlands, that were either bought or stolen or in whatever way obtained during the colonial period and brought to the Netherlands to be exhibited in museums or for scientific purposes, or just because of greed, really. And now that you see this, there is actually a new agreement between Indonesia and the Netherlands that objects that are very important for Indonesia, that they're now looking into how they can return to Indonesia. And indeed, the Diponegoro Kris, which was returned by the Netherlands to Indonesia at the time of the state visit of the Dutch king in 2020. This is the first, like not the first object, because there have been other objects that have been returned to Indonesia before, like for example the famous painting by Raden Saleh of the arrest of the Prince Diponegoro. That was originally, it was actually given by Raden Saleh to the Dutch king when he made it in 1837, but it was returned by the Dutch royal family to Indonesia at the time of the state visit of the Queen Juliana in 1971 to Indonesia, or in that period at least. What you see now is there are actually two committees that have been founded on the Dutch side and on the Indonesian side, and they are going to collaborate together to see, okay, which objects are going to go back to Indonesia. But it's always on the request of Indonesian governments. So they will say, like, we will make an inventory and say these objects are important for Indonesia. They should come back here. So, of course, the buildings that were originally built by the Dutch in Indonesia are now not Dutch anymore. They're all Indonesian buildings. But what does happen as part of the cultural diplomacy between Indonesia and the Netherlands, there is also a lot of exchanges of knowledge about buildings, about historical buildings. So what you see is that, no, the Dutch government does not pay for restoration of colonial buildings, because they say they're not our buildings, that's not our possession. But what you see, there's a lot of, for example, the Dutch government funds or supports historical research into these buildings and helps with thinking or training restorers or other heritage professionals to maintain the buildings or to restore them. So you do see that. And so in that sense there is quite some collaboration between Indonesia and the Netherlands, and it's, for example, about, it happened for the Museum Sejarah Jakarta, but also for different fortresses all over Indonesia. So you do see those kinds of collaborations.